Exactly. So, dear all, thank you for joining us for this fourth and final Creative Pack seminar before the summer. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the Creative Pack, we started our work in 2018 with the intention to provide a step change in the quality of evidence for the creative industries. I think we've been quite successful in the first 5 years, and thanks to 5 more years of funding by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, we will keep growing the evidence base by addressing industry and government's current priorities for the creative industries, while at the same time advancing research into the longer-term challenges and opportunities facing the sector. Since June 2023, the Center has been hosted by Newcastle University in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts. Now, the Creative Pack seminar series is designed to showcase cutting-edge research and foster dialogue across academia, policy, and creative practice. Each session delves into fresh research, followed by an interactive Q&A session. Our seminars are also available on our YouTube channel. The series has been very successful, I have to say, beyond expectations maybe, and we would like to thank you all for your participation. This success has inspired us to start working towards an ambitious program of speakers for the next fall and spring 2025. So please stay tuned for the next seminar series. Now, following the last seminar by Pierluigi Sacco, today's speaker is Professor Jen Snowball. Jen is Professor of Economics and Head of Department at Rhodes University in South Africa. Jen is also a researcher at South African Cultural Observatory, a national research organization funded by the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, which provides up-to-date policy and industry-relevant data on the cultural and creative industries in South Africa. Jen's research interests are focused mainly on cultural economics, the cultural and creative industries, and environmental economics. Research work in cultural economics has included developing and testing a framework for monitoring and evaluation of publicly funded arts and cultural mapping studies, employment in the cultural and creative industries, and international trade in cultural goods and services in emerging markets. Jen has published very widely in economics of arts and culture, and she is a member of the executive board of the Association for the Association of Cultural Economics International. Now, before giving the floor to Jen, a quick reminder of the rules. So the seminar is being recorded. Following Jen's talk, we'll have a Q&A session. So kindly use the Q&A session function to pose your questions, and I'll make sure that they reach Jen. Now, while we may not be able to address all questions during this hour, please rest assured that we are going to collect the questions and reach out to the speaker so that she can have a chance to address your questions. Thank you in advance for your cooperation. And without further ado, let me give the virtual floor to Jen, who will speak about the economic geography of fashion design in South Africa. Thank you, Jen.
Great. Thank you very much, Giorgio, and for everyone who has come. I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that can see the slides, which hopefully is working, right? Okay. So this paper is part of research that was done or commissioned by the South African Cultural Observatory, but is also done under the Africa-Europe Creative Economies Cluster of Research Excellence, which I can talk more about for people who are interested. And the question was really to start research on fashion design in the African context with a focus on South Africa. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really to give some context to fashion in South Africa, in Africa a little bit more broadly, some of the challenges and opportunities of operating in this context, and then also thinking about theories of location and clustering. And then I'll talk a bit about the mapping that we did, which I have to say is like this is phase 1, is the kind of scoping study. Phase 2 will be hopefully much more detailed. So any inputs and suggestions would be really appreciated. Okay, so firstly, why fashion design in Africa? So at the moment, all top 10 exporting countries, that's apparel in general, exporting countries, represent in Africa, represent only about 0.5% of the world's apparel exports. And they tend to be clustered, as you can see in the picture, in the south and also in the east of Africa. But despite the current relatively small size of the sector, the African Development Bank has started to kind of pay more attention to the apparel and footwear market. Firstly, noticing that the rising proportion of middle class people in Africa who've got money to spend represents a really big market. So just for sub-Saharan Africa, $31 billion a year. And in 2021, The Economist picked up particularly the African fashion industry as one of the big 5 stories to watch for that year. So in terms of how African countries view the creative economies, there's also been this big shift to seeing them from a kind of nice to have, maybe things to do with identity and social cohesion, to moving to a realization that this sector can actually help to drive development as well. So the economic advantages are firstly that fashion design and production is labor intensive, and it often includes women and young people who are sometimes left out of other kind of industrial policy development paths. It encourages regional integration, which is part of what the African Union is trying to achieve, both in terms of accessing markets, but also in terms of importing specialist materials from elsewhere. And of course, it has export potential. In addition, there's kind of non-market soft power. So the changing of the narrative from negative impressions of Africa to Africa rising comes across quite strongly in the work that we did as well, in terms of what designers are trying to achieve. And of course, there's a very rich history of textile and fashion design on the African continent, although quite often designers would refer to themselves as sewers or as craftspeople, rather than what have been sort of designated in the West as designers. But there are some challenges to operating in this context. The first one is really strong competition. From 2 sources. The one, of course, is fast fashion. So these are kind of very quickly, low-cost production produced goods and clothes that are coming in from mainly Eastern countries that can be sold for really low prices in African markets. But the other one you may not have thought of, which is the second-hand clothing import market. So in a lot of global North countries, second-hand clothing is collected and then sent to African countries. And in a way, this is good, right? It's about the circular economy. It's about reusing and recycling. But if you are a fashion designer operating in the African context, you now have to compete not only with fast fashion, with international designers, but also with the availability of these really low-price second-hand clothes. So it's kind of a mixed blessing, that one. Also, accessing global value chains can be difficult. So the view of countries in the global south up till now is that they're seen really as potential markets for fashion, or as sites of mass production for fashion houses located in the north. So they're not seen as lead firms or as innovators. And this is starting to change, but issues of international competition and market access obviously are important here as well. Protection of intellectual property is also an issue for some African fashion designers, especially once they start entering the online market. In lots of African countries, there's not very good copyright protection, or it can be very expensive and not very well enforced. And so this means that it's an additional problem for African designers. In some cases, limited capital and infrastructure for startup and for scaling up. And then weirdly, because you'd think Africa would have some kind of advantage here, but local manufacturing can be really expensive, particularly of specialist fabrics. And then because of trade barriers, they can also be difficult to source from other countries. So I'll just talk a little bit about the cultural and creative industries in South Africa to give you a bit of context for the fashion design sector, and share some results from a mapping study done by the South African Cultural Observatory. So on the left-hand side there, you're looking at a map of South Africa divided into the different provinces. And what this shows is the gross value added of the creative industries for each province in South Africa. So not sure if you can see my mouse, but hopefully you can. So here we have Gauteng province. So this is where Johannesburg is. This is the kind of hub of South African industry and production. And you can see that that's mirrored in the creative industries. So nearly half, right, 46.5% of the gross value added of the creative industries comes from this one area. Then we have two other important provinces. This is KwaZulu-Natal, and it's again a province that has a big metro in it, which is Durban, or Durban eThekwini. And so we can see that that contributes about 14% of GVA for creative industries. And then finally, the Western Cape. So this is where Cape Town is. So smaller metro, but still a sort of a big metro with a port and an airport, which is not true of the others. And that contributes around 2.4% of creative industries production. So we can see already that overall, the creative industries follow international patterns to some extent in South Africa, which is that they cluster around the metros. So we see them where they are in terms of the provinces. What the donut shows you is the contribution or the percentage contribution of each of the domains used in the creative industries, how we've divided them up using the UNESCO framework. And you can see that the biggest one in terms of GDP is design and creative services, with sort of 32% of all of the contribution of the creative industries, which makes up about 3% of South Africa's GDP. Might not sound that much in relation to kind of global north countries, but it's not analyzed in official financial statistics separately. It's there. So we're using the national databases to produce this, but it's not routinely produced. So quite a few people were surprised, for example, at how big it was, because agriculture is only kind of 4%, and that's regarded as sort of a really important sector. In terms of cultural and creative industries employment, South Africa is also following some international patterns. So the green bars there show the proportion of people in the different groups who are working for someone else for pay. So in other words, in kind of the traditional informal employments. And then the orangey ones are own account workers with no employees, in other words, freelancers. So if we look at the cultural sector, we can see that there are a lot more freelancers than in non-cultural occupations. And this is particularly the case for women, right? So women in creative occupations are much more likely to be freelancers than women working in other occupations and in people working in the cultural sector who are men. Okay, so that's a little bit of background for South Africa. Now I'm going to sort of zoom in even further to give an overview of the South African clothing and fashion sectors. So if we use national statistics to look at what's happened to the GDP contribution of wearing apparel over time and employment, that's what the diagrams are showing you there, we can see that the trend is like very much down, okay? And this is showing you since after the end of apartheid, so from 1996 to 2021, we can see that both the GDP contribution of the sector and the people employed in the sector has gone down. And the reason for this is that under apartheid, South Africa was not part of the World Trade Organization. And so there was quite a lot of protection of the local clothing and textile sector. But once South Africa liberalized and moved into kind of becoming part of the international community, then it wasn't really possible to protect these sectors as much anymore, and from the consumer's point of view, also not desirable. And so what we saw was that the sector became much smaller, both in the amount that it contributed to GDP and in employment. But the good news is that the fashion design sector has been growing faster than the rest of the sector. So we need to sort of separate the kind of clothing and apparel that would be just the manufacturing to the actual designer wear. And as someone pointed out, which we saw in our data here, as the number of jobs in the formal sector that's shown in the bars here drops, okay, so this is particular labor force participation code, so it goes from 140,000 people to kind of way down here, 40,000 people from 1996 to 2021. But the pale line, which I'm not sure how well you can see, I'm tracing it now with the mouse, that is informal employment in the sector. So what tends to happen is that as formal sector employment declines, so we have factories closing down, for example, you have this pool of young, trained designers who are now striking out on their own, typically starting informally and then moving into the formal sector over time. So it's not totally a bad thing. A recent study, or a pre-COVID study of fashion design firms by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition showed that a lot of them are young firms, so a quarter less than 3 years old, smaller, so most had a turnover of less than 5 million rand per year, a rand being worth about 24 pounds at the moment, I think. Okay, so really kind of micro enterprise, and that the majority of them were selling locally. So that's a kind of a snapshot. So some of the theory of location and clustering, and I'm not going to go on about this a lot, just to kind of highlight things that we used in the research, is that internationally we know that fashion designers tend to cluster in urban areas for very good reasons. So firstly, access to markets, right? So it's easier to market to people who are in a big city or a metro. It's easier to source specialist services and supplies if you're in a larger city, and there are more opportunities for networking, branding, and marketing. So we know that internationally, the fashion cities have been really important: London, Paris, New York. In the African context, it's kind of Johannesburg and Lagos. And so what we were interested in is, if we really zoom in to the South African landscape as an example, where do we find the fashion designers, right? How are they located, given the background of the big fashion cities and the big cities in South Africa? The theory says, there's an emerging stream of theory, I should say, that mid-sized cities might offer some opportunities for fashion designers, and they might prefer that, at least as a starting point, or even as a place to be based. Firstly, better lifestyle, right? So less commuting times, for example, lower costs, so property costs much less, and also space, like workshop or production space, costs less. And there's less competition if you're starting in a smaller city, and maybe if it's your home city, it could be stronger networks, okay? So it would be easier to become known, to make a name for yourself in your hometown or city than to leave straight away and become one more unknown designer in a big city. This links to a very interesting paper by Bridges and Schrax, who looked at different kinds of mobilities for fashion designers in the Canadian context. And they pointed out that mobility has increased in a lot of ways, and this is maybe offering, well, people in the creative industries, artistic producers, but especially fashion designers, some options in where they are located. So temporary mobility are a group of people who would sort of almost commute between the smaller city or town where they live, when they have their families and raise their children and maybe have their design space, and a reasonably close by city, right? So you can spend some of your days in the city, but you can then spend most of your time in the smaller town, and that's been facilitated by things like better transport networks. There's also mediated mobility, so you don't have to have your whole business based in one place. So, for example, there were designers who had part of their marketing team or some of their production activities that were based in the big cities, while they themselves were based in the smaller towns. And then, of course, virtual mobility, which is kind of what we're doing now. So the ability and the acceptance of working online. So these different kinds of mobilities may also be facilitating the dispersion of fashion designers. Okay, so for this research, the first thing we had to do was to construct a database of the South African fashion designers. And the way that we did this, because there wasn't one database available, we don't have very good industry level databases. So the way that we did it was, firstly, we said the designer needed to have some kind of brand or business. So it couldn't just be somebody who sells at the local market. They needed to have a kind of registered brand to be part of the database. So it could be part-time, that was fine. It could be informal, that was also fine. But they needed to be a core part of the business that was there. And so what we did was we consulted industry databases, Fashion Council of South Africa, for example, or the Craft and Design Institute. We, of course, did web scraping to find people online who were had a website of some sort. And then we also looked at things like the online yellow pages, which is like a kind of telephone directory to try and find fashion designers who maybe didn't have a very strong online presence. And the other source was online platforms for selling fashion design, and we could then get some databases from them. So we really tried our best to do as broad a sweep as we could. And then we also did some case studies of selected young up-and-coming designers, or some not so young, more established, to try and see whether the kinds of challenges and the focus that they had was related to what the literature said, but also to see whether they were commenting on their connections to smaller towns or cities and how their career had developed in terms of where they were located. So I'll just give a snapshot of these results as not to take up too much time. So our database tracked about 450 entities who were part of the fashion design ecosystem. So in our kind of sweep, we realized that there were kind of important parts of the system that were not fashion designers themselves. So these included specialist education and training resources like design colleges or specific diplomas being offered by technical colleges, for example, industry organizations, which could be provincial fashion councils or other kinds of associations, fashion week groups, fashion media specialists, and then a small number of specialists manufacturing and design. So that was our initial database. Okay, so what did it look like? So the map on the left, you recognize now, I'm sure. So this is showing you South Africa by province, and we're looking at where the fashion ecosystem rests, okay? And you can quickly see that the two most important provinces for fashion designers and the related organizations are once again Gauteng province. So this is around Johannesburg and Pretoria area, and the Western Cape, okay, around Cape Town, Interestingly, not KwaZulu-Natal. And that it was a surprise for us because that's where our second biggest metro is. So that's something to explore kind of a bit more later on. We did see a cluster there, but it wasn't nearly as big as we expected. Then we also mapped by the actual number of fashion designers. And the bigger the circle is, the bigger the cluster, right? So the interesting thing for us here was that, yes, we're seeing clusters in the two provinces that I mentioned, but in the more rural provinces, like the Eastern Cape, which is kind of where I am, okay, addressing you from, and also in the north, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, there were smaller clusters, but they were definitely there. And so these were around sort of second-tier cities. So that for us was an interesting initial indication that fashion designers are actually more dispersed than other sectors of the creative economy. So the fashion cities in South Africa, as you've seen, is Johannesburg and Cape Town. So we then sort of try to see more detail, what sort of infrastructure, particularly related to fashion and design, could we find in these cities. So Johannesburg, of course, an economic hub of South Africa, has the largest population of any city, so around 5.6 million, and also started almost straight after the end of apartheid with promoting fashion and design. So a lot of people think of Johannesburg as this kind of big industrial mining heartland, which there are, but not the mining anymore. But certainly they are the industrial powerhouse, but they're also the creative industries powerhouse, right? And for a lot of South Africans, this comes as a big surprise. But actually, the creative industries have been in Johannesburg for a really long time. So this was our first South African Fashion Week is established. It's still running. It was then joined by the Soweto Fashion Week in 2011. So Soweto is kind of like a suburb of Johannesburg really now. They've joined up. So it's kind of one big urban conglomeration. And the other thing that's interesting, if you read the sort of historical literature, is that initially South African Fashion Week really focused on Western or global North fashion designers, with a few South African ones kind of included, but that has really shifted. So in recent times, there are still, of course, some international global North fashion designers that are showcased, but it's mostly South African, other African, and then from the African diaspora. So there's a definite kind of identity or flavor starting to emerge there. Johannesburg also has a project called the Johannesburg Fashion District. So this was partly a kind of inner city regeneration project to try and encourage small emerging fashion designers and maybe larger manufacturers to cluster or relocate. So this hasn't worked quite as well as was hoped for a whole lot of reasons around infrastructure and safety, but it's still there. And there are quite a number of fashion designers. So there's a very deliberate attempt to try and cluster the industry. Cape Town is a slightly smaller city. In 2014, it was registered as a World Design Capital. It's had a fashion week also for quite a long time. And it's home to one of the biggest industry organizations, which is the Craft and Design Institute, which has a lot of fashion designers as members. And the interesting thing about Cape Town, of course, is that its whole identity is not industrial, right? It's creative, it's design, it's film. So a lot of South Africans would think of Cape Town as the creative capital, even though in fact Johannesburg is well ahead. So one of the things we also found interesting was that if you are in a province that has one of these kind of big fashion cities, then the chances are that if you are a fashion designer, you are based in that city. So for example, like 89% of all the fashion designers that we could find in the Western Cape were in Cape Town, right? So they're clustered in that province. The same thing in Johannesburg. So they've got a smaller kind of cluster, but 70% of all the fashion designers in Gauteng province were in Johannesburg. So it's almost as if the big fashion city has got this very powerful pull for the fashion designers in that province. But if you looked at some of the provinces with smaller cities, like second-tier cities, so if we look at the Eastern Cape, which is where I'm based, then our second-tier metro here, so a much smaller city, is Gqeberha, and you can see that there is a cluster there, but only about half of the fashion designers in the Eastern Cape are based in the second-tier metro, and the rest are kind of clustered, but in smaller cities and towns. So they're much more kind of dispersed. And this was quite interesting for us because one of the challenges for economic development in South Africa, like in many countries, is of course balanced regional development. But we know that some parts of the creative industries are just really not made for being based in rural areas or small towns. So when we find some sectors that seem to be able to cluster in smaller cities and towns, then that does show some development potential. Okay, just very briefly in the last few minutes, I'll just talk a little bit about the fashion designer case studies that we did. So these were the people that were selected, basically based on as much variety as possible. So in terms of the different brand focus that they have, also in terms of their how long the business has been around. So for example, I think the most recent one was Thando Mthuli for Munkus. So that was established only in 2021. Whereas you have ones like Lokshin Kulka from Wandi Nzimande, who've been around for really quite some time. And then what we did was we analyzed each of their locational decisions as their careers developed, and a secondary part of this research was also on environmental sustainability initiatives. So just to give two examples, this is somebody who's actually started in the Eastern Cape. So this is Laduma Nokolo, who founded Makosa Africa. So he was born in Gqeberha, which is the second-tier metro in a rural province. And he went to university, so he came through the Nelson Mandela University. And as part of the university incubator in the second-tier city, he then starts to develop his own fashion design, which, as you can see, is knitwear based on traditional Xhosa beadwork designs. And, you know, stories about how this links to his heritage and to his family. So he first establishes himself in this mid-tier city. He starts to sell a little bit online. He wins some awards, and then he starts to branch out. So at the moment, he is located in Cape Town, which is where he opens another sort of branch. And he has suppliers or stockists in Johannesburg, and then a very big online presence, right? So this is somebody who's obviously using all kinds of different mobilities to use a second-tier city as a base, but then to expand into a larger city. This one is quite interesting. So this is one of our newest fashion designer case studies in the group. And this is Refilo Mapitso Taitsi, and she starts Shweshwe Kini. So Shweshwe is a fabric type, a print associated with the Basotho culture. And she is actually from Lesotho, which is the small mountain country completely surrounded by South Africa. And she then also uses her rural roots, I suppose, her heritage, to leverage off and to inspire her fashion design, which has become very, very successful. So she talks about early memories, about seeing her mother and her family walking to church or to other family functions wearing this very iconic Shweshwe fabric. So she actually works part-time as an occupational therapist. So she's a trained occupational therapist, but and not even in the biggest city in the province. So she's also operating from the Free State, which is a kind of that central province. It's got one biggish city, which is Bloemfontein, but she's not even based in Bloemfontein. She's based in an even smaller town, Welkom, And what she does is almost exclusively uses mobilities to market her fashion. So online is very important, and then she travels to Johannesburg and Cape Town for special kinds of events. So I can't go through all of this now. The report is publicly available if you would like to know more, but just to draw out a few of the common themes and attributes, right? So the first thing is that all the designers who were in the case study group, who I admit we chose people who were showing some success in their business, all had really high levels of human capital. So these are not designers who are sort of coming through traditionally taught artisanal kind of processes. They all had degrees or diplomas. They'd been involved in some kind of internships. They'd been supported through government emerging creative projects, and they'd been part of big national showcases like the Design Indaba. But nevertheless, they found access to finance a challenge. So it was something that almost all of them mentioned. They started out with a loan from a family or self-financing it through a secondary job, or in one case through crowdsourcing. They all have a commitment to sustainability. So they often talk about using local materials, but also about connecting with local communities and focusing on development in the sort of broader sense in terms of who they employ and who they train or mentor. And then the other strong theme was drawing on African culture and heritage influences to make their brand unique. Sometimes in quite a modern, controversial way. So, for example, Thebe Magugu, who produces kind of really modern takes on things, had one collection called Home Economics, which was drawing on the sort of, I suppose, the visuals or the wearing apparel of Black African women who often work as domestic workers, and the politics around that, and then also domestic violence. So that was one of his more kind of modern influences. And all of them have this aspiration or inspiration to be part of the international market. Okay, so to nearly conclude, what we're doing through the work of the South African Cultural Observatory and other collectives is to think about the contribution, or to make visible the contribution of the creative economy in South Africa to employment, to international trade, to economic growth. And the designer fashion sector is a really important, interesting, fast-growing part of that. Although we have to say it is still clustered around the fashion cities of Johannesburg and Cape Town in the provinces with the two largest metros, we're also seeing some interesting patterns in secondary cities, which we're not with the rest of the creative industries, right? So we are seeing the potential for smaller clusters, perhaps as a result of taking part or taking advantage of these different mobilities, which are much more accepted now. So the second phase of this research, or the first phase was this kind of a mapping, would be to use our database to actually survey a much larger range of fashion designers to find out what they think about this idea. There's strong connections though. So even to fashion designers who are based now in big cities, when they talk about their brand and their style, they would refer back often to the rural areas which hold really important cultural significance and inspiration for them. And then the other thing that we realize we need to know more about is the whole fashion ecosystem. So not just the designers, but how they operate, how they reach their markets, the retail sector, and downstream the supply side of things. Before I close, a word from our sponsor. No, it's just an advert. So we've recently launched the African Journal of Creative Economy. So this is an international journal which has an open access publisher based in South Africa. It is specifically focused on African and global South economies and the creative sector in those economies and how that operates. but it doesn't have to be only about Africa. It can be things of interest to Africa. So, for example, things related to the gig economy or to platforms or whatever it might be. We're multidisciplinary, so we cover cultural economics, creative industries, arts and culture management, and cultural studies and cultural policy. The journal is open for submissions. We've published the first editorial that gives more information about the scope. And so if you have any papers in mind, we would very much like to consider them. The journal is also part of the Africa-Europe Creative Economies Cluster of Research Excellence, which links universities, research-intensive universities in Africa and also in the UK and Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jen. This was great. Thank you for the great presentation. I'm sure our audience has clearly everybody's learned a lot from this, and also for the promotion of scholarly work, advancement of scholarly work on South African creative industries with your journal. So as usual, now we have around 15 minutes of Q&A session. We have already a couple of questions lined up. So my role as chair is just to pose the questions to you, and then I'll leave myself for last if I have the time. So the first question is from our own Jonathan Sapsud, who's asking, well, first of all, is complimenting you on the seminar, but he has a quite interesting question from the point of view of institutional theory. So institutional theory seems good for explaining legitimization of designer fashion, and Mukti Kair's work on designer fashion in India, for example. Institutions like design weeks seem really important. I know other African countries like Rwanda are also trying to develop this sector. So how real is the Pan-African possibility in this respect, given the diversity, and does this make sense more so than individual initiatives? I think that's the first question from Jonathan. Would you like to answer this question first, and then I'll go to the second one?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So if I understood it correctly, it's about, basically Pan-African versus individual country.
I think that's,
yeah. Well, good question. And in fact, a question that the whole of the so-called African Union is grappling with at the moment. So right now, the African Union is a good idea, but not a reality. So we're getting ready to put in place the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is supposed to kind of help to promote intra-African trade. Yeah, it's a bumpy ride because there are local what shall I say, specializations and areas where there's a strong cluster around a particular culture or fashion group. So, of course, there's always going to be competition between different countries and different designers, but we're also seeing some signs of collaboration, particularly in terms of promoting the sector. So the idea of African fashion as being something that has a distinct identity, however various that might be, is starting to gain traction. So it's a way of saying this is something that has value. So, for example, the V&A Museum recently had an exhibition on African fashion. And so this seems to me it is a growing acknowledgement that this is a thing, right? But it's still quite contested in terms of saying, well, why should it be one thing? So it's lumpy at the moment, Jonathan. I've done a terrible job of answering that question. The other problem is that South Africa is still pretty dominant. So one of the reasons why many countries, Nigeria included, did not want to sign anything related to the African free trade continental areas. Of course, there are going to be winners and losers. And so the negotiations around that are quite fraught. And we have yet to see what kind of cultural exceptions they're going to be. So in any free trade, there's always a cultural exception.
That's a very important point, I think, definitely.
Mm.
So there's a second question by Rodrigo, who's asking, well, again, congratulations for the work, but also he's asking a question about international perspective on South African fashion and how important it is in terms of fashion design, exporting, and also what is the kind of international presence internationally. And I think there is a more fundamental question, which is in terms of how much do you think the big fast fashion international companies have space in South African fashion consumption, and whether they could be an obstacle in terms of developing local talent. So I think the question is really about the relationship between big, international fast fashion and local talent, and whether they are complementary or substitutes in a way.
Well, I mean, as the data shows us, clothing exports from even the top 10 African countries is less than 0.5% of the total global clothing exports. So at the moment, I think fashion from the African continent it's minor, right, in the international market. So at the moment, it would be kind of like a niche thing that's spreading through the celebration of particular individual designers, or through things like the V&A exhibition, or through the diaspora, right, being a very important way of spreading information, and fashion design, kind of consumption. So it's small currently. I won't, I won't beat around the bush on that. But I think we're sort of punching above our weight in the sense that given the size of the industry, it gets quite a lot of media coverage and attention, or shall I say, an increasing amount of media coverage and attention. So it seems like it's a space for potential. In a similar way to the Korean wave was like, well, why are we listening to Korean music? And it seems strange, right? But it has had like a large amount of penetration through some very clever, I have to say, policies on the part of the government and a lot of promotion. So this is also a sector that a lot of African countries want to get behind and want to promote because of its developments. Potential. In terms of the penetration of fast fashion into the South African market, it's really big. Okay, so we actually found like a mismatch between the designers who said we want to produce high quality, well-designed clothing that will last for a long time, is sustainable, and so on, and the consumers who are often this kind of young city crowd who don't have a lot of money, right? So maybe don't have the option of investing in designer pieces, although there's a sort of rising middle class, and so tend to buy a lot of fast fashion that's been imported mostly from China and India. Yeah.
So there's an additional question from Daniel. So the question is, how much do households in South Africa actually spend on fashion? And also, as there being growth in the local people's fashion consumption, along with the growth of fashion industry, or is the growth driven by exports to other countries in Africa or outside Africa? I think it's partly to relate to what you were saying earlier, but it's likely different in terms of question, in terms of, I think, propensity to consume.
Yeah, so although South Africa looks like a middle-income country, if you look at average household incomes, it's very skewed, right? So we've got, as you know, one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. So there is a sort of minority of the population, maybe we're looking at the top 10%, who are wealthy and who spend a lot on fashion. So if you were to go to some of the fashion hubs, or some of the large designer malls, your shopping spaces in Cape Town or Johannesburg, you would be really impressed by the local fashion designers who are there, as well as some international brands. But if we look at the sort of the majority of South African households, they don't have a lot of disposable income. And that means that they're quite cautious about investing in clothing. Having said that, clothing is a really important part of identity in South Africa. So even lower income households would tend to save up for those kind of special pieces, which are often custom made. So I've also done some research on the sort of custom made clothing, traditional clothing, and the seamstresses who are involved in that. And it's really bigger than you think. You know, there are a lot of these small scale, often informal, mostly women who do bespoke. They would say they're bespoke tailors. You know, they wouldn't say I'm a fashion designer, but they do individual pieces. And this is for even people who live in really rural areas, as well as the wealthier people who live in
really
cities.
curious about this, because clearly this is to me a quite important part of the story in terms of inclusivity, and again, it may be quite difficult to capture in terms of clustering effects as well, but it's such an important part of the story when it comes to a country like South Africa. And I think it's partly related to the next question, which is by Kenneth, who's asking whether you see tensions between the often legitimate expectations for job creation and GDP growth against the more qualitative outcomes bordering their cultural, social, environmental importance, and in what ways have these tensions manifested, if they have?
Well, I think in fashion design, certainly the case studies that we looked at, the tension was really between what the consumers were willing and able to purchase and what the designers were trying to produce. So there wasn't really this trade-off between job creation or people saying you should, you know, do more on job creation. So up until now, the government really hasn't spent much in terms of public policy or public support on the fashion design sector. They're seen as a commercial sector that can find their own way, you know. So beyond some training programs and a few sponsoring of a few trade shows like the Design Indaba, it's all been private sector. And that includes the fashion weeks, right? The fashion weeks are private companies that are sometimes supported by local authorities, municipalities, or city councils, but they're for-profit private companies. So this hasn't been a sector that's got a lot of government support, and it does tend to employ quite a lot of people. The fashion designers themselves, when they move into that phase of manufacturing, some of them spend a lot of time and effort in trying to train local people, to mentor young people, obviously for their own benefit, right? So they can manufacture it efficiently themselves, but also because they feel very strongly about community development. So a kind of sustainable local community development is part of their ethos. But then, okay, that is going to push up the price of the garment, and then it's really hard to compete with the fast fashion imports. Yeah.
I see. Thank you. So so I have an additional question, which is again by Daniel, related to the earlier response. Are seamstresses or tailors included in the data as designers or as another category? I think that's really the question. Are they included in the sample that you were analyzing, or they're excluded?
No, they weren't, because they don't have a brand, right? So we were saying we're looking for people who've got a fashion brand. And we've done other research, and the only way to find them is actually to hang out in fabric shops, which we did for quite some time, because the people in the fabric supplying shops, they know who are the people who's sewing for commercial purposes. So they were not included in our sample. And probably there are a fair number of informal designers who have no online presence, right? Who operate purely on in-person networks that we've also missed out. So what we've got are the sort of more developed commercial designers in our sample. And we imagine that there's an informal sector, and as you said, the tailors or seamstresses who don't see themselves as designers, who are also part of that ecosystem. that's a paper for another day.
Another day. So, Jen, we have very few minutes remaining. Let me ask a question or make a comment. I think it's been really interesting from your presentation to see how there are many similarities actually between creative industries and fashion in this case in South Africa and in many other countries, including the UK, many developed countries. For example, the issue of concentration, the issue of sustainability is becoming quite important, the issue of finance, although and scaling up and the size of businesses in the case of South Africa, clearly many micro enterprises, but also in the UK we know that's the case. But also education, the importance of education in order to increase value. But there are also some differences, it seems like, in terms of local expression, brand development, but also access to international markets, which can be an issue. And I have a very small, maybe well, not that small, but a question on this, right? As Africa develops and grows, and you're going to have more internal demand, but also more international demand and international penetration, how do you see, we know that global shock can trigger further concentration as well. So, and this can clearly create a tension between the center and the periphery, a loss of cultural diversity. So how much of this is a tension? Because on one side, you want to compete by using local expression, you want to protect it, and you want to expand scale on this to become internationally competitive, but at the same time, there's the downside of the part of cultural expression and potentially more concentration rather than dispersion, which I think is one of the points that the paper is trying to make.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that is definitely a sign of well, a site of tension. We haven't got there yet, right? So none of the designers that we were talking about or talking to mentioned this kind of tension between wanting to upscale or to standardize. So they were really working on kind of small collections that were produced in their own workshops or by specialist manufacturers. In terms of trade, I don't know, in the case of fashion, whether we're going to see loss of diversity. I mean, I think that especially for trade within Africa, which has been growing in the cultural sector. So when we've been tracking, well, at least the cultural goods trade, right? Then we've seen that other African countries are becoming more and more important for South Africa's cultural trade. So there seems to be quite a potential there for more balanced regional trade in cultural goods and services. But for sure, I mean, this is one of the big things with any kind of free trade area or union, who's going to win and who's going to lose.
Winners and the losers,
At the moment, that's all still under negotiation. So there's some trials around this that are happening at the moment. And as I said, we'll watch very carefully to see what kind of cultural exceptions there are. But I think at the moment, it's more like more inter-African trade or more international exposure is going to feed into like the richness of what the fashion designers are producing.
Thank you very much, Jen. I think time is tyranny, and we have to bring the seminar to a closing. So thank you again for your engaging presentation. I'm sure online will agree that you broaden our understanding of the role of creative industries in South Africa and in the global South more generally, I think. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our funders at the HRC and the team at Newcastle University and the Creative PEC, in particular Ingrid, Billy, Anna, Alice, Tom, and last but not least, Hassan, our center director. Now, as mentioned previously, we're planning the webinar series for the next academic year with another set of stellar speakers. So please stay tuned and register in our newsletter so you can be informed about all the new initiatives that we are developing. So thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar. Thank you again, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.